We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The Department of Education may be under the gun if a second Trump presidency comes along. Now, to talk about what that could actually mean in terms of how education works across the country and how it's worked historically before there was such a department, we're joined by Editor-at-Large, Jim Fight. Thanks for being here, Jim.
Hey, nice to be here, Mark. Thanks for having me.
So, what is Donald Trump proposing? Let's get the basics out first.
Well, in the normal Donald Trump fashion, he's proposing something simple: disband the Department of Education.
I mean, that's a fairly simple policy platform. The useful thing about the Trump policies are they're pretty easy to follow, right?
Oh yeah, anyone can understand them. As you may recall from the original campaign, they're so simple. A lot of people thought they were jokes, and then
very much
on us.
so.
No, he was serious, and actually did some.
He did indeed. So abolishing the Department of Education, that would put us back to what, 1979 in terms of how education is managed?
More or less. Yeah, Jimmy Carter signed the Department of Education Act in October of 1979, and it actually got up and running in May of 1980. But yeah, it would bring us back to 70s style education as far as government regulation goes. Now, I mean, a lot of things have changed since then that probably wouldn't immediately change back.
Okay, so I presume then that the people that are quite incited by this prospect of the Department of Education being shut down, they're pointing to the incredible test scores that have come out of the United States of America since the introduction of the Department of Education. Surely that's the way for them to argue their case, right, Jim?
Yeah, you would think so, Mark. But if you look, I'm laughing because those, for those who might not have heard that, there was sarcasm there.
Yes.
No, and it's not that we're doing any worse necessarily in standardized testing. We're just not really doing any better either. So what we saw was, and by the way, standardized test scores had dropped off in the 60s and 70s, which I guess you could say was the crisis that started this whole Department of Education thing to begin with. But the Department of Education didn't fix it. We saw test scores in math and reading. Actually, certain tests like the SAT and the ACT, we saw test scores drop a little bit for a little while and then come back up some. But then even for the tests done by the international agencies that track and rank countries, our testing didn't really improve, didn't change much at all. It improved by a few points over the years, and then of course cratered again during COVID. So we're left with a net change of less than 2% increase in standardized test scores over half a century for billions upon billions of dollars spent.
And there's actually a point there that I'd like to dig a bit deeper into. You said looking at the international agencies that measure these things, you see, as far as I'm aware, America's actually dropped in the ranking. So although since
quite a bit and quite rapidly.
Yeah, so since the inception of the Department of Education, American education, according to domestic testing, hasn't really fluctuated very much. It's gone up and down a little bit, but it's basically where it was 1979, 1980. But other countries have actually improved their educational positions, specifically with regards to sciences, maths, technologies, reading, language, things like this. Other countries have actually, in many ways, they appear to have innovated education and pushed the margins of what the students could be doing, whereas that hasn't happened or doesn't appear to have happened in the United States.
True. And there was a time, well, in the 70s and 80s, America was considered the world leader in education. By the time I was in high school in the late 90s, early 2000s, the big headline was, we've fallen behind. We're in 16th position internationally. But as of the 2022 testing, we're actually ranked 34th out of 80. That's not great.
It's not, is it? It's not. Well,
No.
it's in the top half. Let's go that.
Yeah, barely,
It's in the
but
top half. What's
that's
that?
it.
A D?
Yeah, yeah.
Roughly a D?
It's a mid D. Yeah. Uh,
Okay. So let's talk about what would happen then if Donald Trump wins the election in November and he does abolish the Department of Education. What happens to education?
well, if you follow social media and see some of the panic posts, you'll understand that disabled children will, for some strange reason, be kicked out of school, I guess.
Because,
Uh,
of course, disabled children prior to 1979 were banned from schools, right?
I wasn't aware of that, but apparently that's the case. No, really, the only thing that will change immediately is there won't be a government department, a branch of the executive branch of the federal government that costs us tens of billions and occasionally hundred billion per year to run, uh, meddling with how each state or municipality or even individual school district runs its schools. But
So,
schools aren't going to just shut down like, oh, there's no Department of Education. What are we going to do? Teachers have been teaching for far longer than there has been a Department of Education. I suspect they will continue to teach once it's gone.
and presumably, the Department of Education doesn't pay for the schools to be built. It doesn't pay the
No, that's
teacher's
correct.
salary.
The Department of Education does contribute some small portion
Okay,
to public school funding, but again, that's still taxpayer dollars. Uh,
right.
for the most part, the states are the ones and municipalities are the ones that most of the tax money that goes to schools comes from real estate and property tax.
Very interesting. Uh, so let's model this out a bit because I'm a studier of educational systems, and it's always seemed to me that the idea of one overarching bureaucracy being in charge of education through an entire nation is bound to bring about certain inefficiencies. And it seems to me that, and it's just my theory, that 50 petri dishes of educational experiments going across the country. Now, of course, no state will say, well, let's drop math and English and science and start teaching falconry. Although falconry, it's a
It is an
skill, the
interesting. I would have
sport of
taken that
kings.
course.
I would take that course. Uh, but what we'd have is essentially a free market of competitive ideas for how to improve schools, wouldn't we?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, not sorry,
And you can
maybe
see.
how to improve education rather than schools, I think.
I would suspect so. And you can look at for example, you can look at the sports programs to see that, right?
Mm.
Schools compete schools compete in sports and other competitive things. Uh, and the ones that do well get more funding, and the ones that do well apply that funding to, you could expect a similar outcome if the federal government weren't didn't have his hand in the pie, directing things. But also on the whole inefficiency thing, I suspect that may be part of why we've fallen behind, or perhaps I should say, been left behind by
Mm.
so many other nations. Some of those nations are going to have the educational system more or less that we'll have once we're rid of the Department of Education. Some have national departments of education or something of the like, but also much smaller populations. So our issue is we have a single Department of Education at the federal level that is supposed to be in some way in charge of the education of 311 million people. That's a lot across what 5,000 miles coast to coast. I mean, it's or 3,000 miles coast to coast. It's a massive swath of land with a ridiculous amount of people in it, and in different subcultures and everything, and all of these schools are run by a single federal department, or at least in part directed, not entirely run, but at least in part directed by a single federal department.
Jim Fight, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Hey, it's been a blast, Mark.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to say a special thank you to our guests today, Liberty Nation Senior Political Analyst Tim Donner, Economics Guru Andrew Moran, and Editor-at-Large James Fight. And of course, thank you, the listeners at home, for joining us and taking the time each week to tune in and see what Liberty Nation Radio has to offer. Thanks for being here.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.